Hey there, community bankers. Welcome back to the Correspondent podcast from Independent Correspondent Bankers Bank. I'm your host, Madison Kaplinger, Marketing Specialist for ICBB. With the way technology continues to evolve, I have constant conversations with bankers who fear losing the personal touch that sets community banks apart. I've long thought that the convenience technology provides doesn't have to be at odds with a relationship style of banking, which is why I sat down with Joan Marsili, a longtime banker and chief growth officer at Marsili Growth Advisory. She recently co-hosted a webinar about leveraging what she calls unreasonable hospitality to prove marketing ROI and drive bank growth. She outlines an approach that focuses on the customer experience and personal touch while still satisfying your board and C-suite's desire to see a return on investment. Please welcome Joan to the podcast. Hey there, community bankers. I'm here with Joan Marsili, who is the Chief Growth Officer at Marsili Growth Advisory. How are you doing today, Joan?
I'm fine. Thanks, Madison. Thank you for inviting me on to talk.
Thank you for coming on. I think this topic is so interesting, and I'm really excited to kind of dive into it and hear your thoughts. But before that, tell us a little bit about yourself and your career. I know in the last year or two, you started your own venture, Marsili Growth Advisory. So just, kind of walk us through where you've been and how you got there.
I have been a banker for almost 25 years, really in marketing and sales and cash management operations. In the last few years, I worked for a bank in Massachusetts where I was a chief growth officer and client experience officer. So basically responsible for any journey the client took throughout the whole bank, was in charge of retail sales, marketing, cash management, the client care center, deposit operations. So I really had kind of an opportunity to bring all of those pieces together at my former bank. And about a year ago, I started Marsili Growth Advisory. And so just working on, basically positioning the client experience and helping bankers grow revenue. That's really my focus.
Right. And now I'm trying to think back. I met you at the ABA's Bank Marketing School in 2024. Did you teach this session on measuring ROI?
Yes, I've been teaching marketing ROI, return on investment for really at least a decade now, and basically, how to teach bankers, how to teach bank marketers how to measure their activity and show their worth to the organization.
Yeah, I thought that session was so helpful, so interesting, and actually knowing that that's kind of part of, what you teach kind of makes this conversation even more interesting to me. So you hosted a webinar recently titled From Transaction to Transformation, Leveraging Unreasonable Hospitality to Prove Marketing ROI and Drive Bank Growth. And those don't sound like two things that go together, right? Marketing ROI and unreasonable hospitality. Yes. I know that's near and dear to your heart, and it sounds like such an interesting concept. Can you kind of sum up the idea for us?
Sure. So many times you get into a C-suite and they talk about technology and compliance and all of the new bright shiny tools like AI and things like that. But at the end of the day, the balance sheet and the income statement in most community banks have people on the other side of that money. And I think sometimes we forget that it's the people that really kind of drive our success as a bank. Are we doing the things that we need to do? Are we positioning ourselves so that we're helpful through the process? And it doesn't matter if it's branch, if it's call center, if it's digital. It matters how we show up as bankers to the people who need the help when they need it. And that's basically the concept of it. But then the backside of that is retention is a serious issue, right? 20% of people change banks every year. And you don't just want to churn clients over and over and over again. That's a waste of money. It's a waste of time. So if you put your time and effort and energy into creating an experience, people don't want to leave the people that they really like and they really trust. So that's kind of the backstory to all of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you put it that way. I know hospitality is not a word we associate with banking a lot of the time. Like you said, you get into C-suites, we're talking a lot about technology and compliance and things like AI. So for a banker listening who thinks maybe this sounds a bit fluffy or, woo-woo or whatever, what is unreasonable hospitality? I think you alluded to this a bit when talking about retention and churn, but what does unreasonable hospitality actually look like in a retail or commercial banking context?
So when we think about unreasonable hospitality, and all of this kind of concept is based on a book called Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidara, and it really is about restaurants. But I used it as a book club for my team and their teams. And we had such wonderful conversation about how we could build unreasonable hospitality. Because the truth of the matter is, someone is calling a banker when they need something. And people buy from people they like. They will suffer through a poor experience, but they're not going to stay with you. And so figuring out exactly what does that journey look like for the client, how is it happening, what's going on, are we struggling with maybe operations isn't as quick as they need to be, or the retail staff is not as trained as they should be. There's a lot of things that happen in that interaction with the client. So it's about really kind of focusing, everybody's talked about client journeys, right? We've all heard those words before, right? But it's about mapping what you want that interaction to look like. I use the concept every moment matters, right? So as the client is coming through, even as they walk up to the door, right? Is your facility clean? Is it, are the flowers blooming, or do you have dead buds all over the place? Even from the very beginning impression, all the way through to what they need. And think about just life stage, right? Somebody has fraud on their account. Maybe somebody's funds have been stolen. I mean, think about, money is a very visceral, emotional piece for everybody. There's not many people who don't think about money emotionally. So being able to map out the journey, then train the staff to what you want. Marketers can only do so much. They have to have their business partners in retail, in commercial banking, in operations, in the call center. Everybody's got to be on the same page as you work through that. But one of the things that, through 20 years of experience is that we tend to go after the shiny objects, and we're not disciplined, and we're not persistent, and we don't train effectively to map the journey that we really want to have happen. Because when we do that, we won't lose clients. We won't have to worry about retention. We will automatically do that. And the other part of that is, when you can have good conversations and people trust you, they're more likely to come and buy other things from you, right? So it really is about growth and revenue. It isn't woo-woo. It isn't fluffy. But I think it's harder to pin down. It's not numbers that show up in a balance sheet, except, they will eventually. So people tend to maybe not take them as seriously as they should.
Absolutely. And you hit on two different things that I want to kind of parse out and discuss a little more. One of them being the piece you mentioned about collaborating with frontline staff, tellers, and loan officers, customer service reps. I mean, marketing can ideate about this all day long, but if the people on the front lines don't buy in, then it just falls flat. So how does marketing collaborate with retail and operations staff to empower them to make these hospitable calls on the fly so that they're also bought in?
That's a great question, and it's not a simple or an overnight process. You really have to build a relationship with your business partners. Marketing is there to help them grow, to help them succeed. And through that, and by laying that on the table, I am, we're going to be more successful than we could ever be separately. The more you're able to do that, the more you're able to build a relationship with your partners throughout the bank, the easier this becomes. It's not to say this is an easy process. It's just marketing can't do it alone. And marketing can only bring it to the table and work through it with their teammates in other parts of the bank. And that's why it's so important that the C-suite buys in and that they also hold responsible the idea that this is appropriate and this is where we're going to focus our time, effort, and energy.
Right, definitely. And I'm glad you brought up the C-suite again, because that is the other question I wanted to ask. I think it's obvious to marketers, bank marketers, and the way that we work and the way we see things, the tie between the customer experience and ROI, even if that's not something you can see immediately and it takes time to really show up on the balance sheet. And for that reason, I think a lot of bank marketers listening right now have probably had a painful meeting with their CFO or their board trying to defend their budget, right? And, hospitality sounds expensive. So how do you track and measure the ROI of a quote unquote unreasonable gesture and present it in a way that, the board and the C-suite can see it as a growth driver rather than just a line item expense?
So the key is to kind of step back into the data, right? There are lots of things that you can look at. You can look at retention. You can look at cross-sell. You can look at acquisition. You could look at the use of a debit card and how people are using that and what that experience looks like. What people experience when they call into a contact center, right? Are they getting someone who's going to shuffle them around? Or are they going to get an experienced banker who's on the other end of that line who can help them maneuver through whatever problem they have, right? We've all been frustrated by dial one for this, dial one for that, or repeat your address, repeat your name, right, over and over and over again because you're talking to a bot, right? The thing is, all of those artificial intelligence technology helps the situation. It isn't the situation. Technology is not the experience. And it never will be the experience. And in fact, there's a lot of articles out now where there's a little bit of a pushback against, they want to talk to a human, especially older people and younger people, right? In the middle, we're kind of used to this, but the older generation and really younger generation don't necessarily want to, if they have a problem, talk to a bot or talk to some kind of VRU that's going to move them through. They want to talk to a person. So you start with the data, right? How are you doing? Your CSATs, your NPS scores, right? some people will stop at a good NPS score. My NPS score is in the 70s. It's fine. I don't have to worry about it. But if they looked at all of the different pieces that they had, they would be able to see that, well, you know what, this part's doing really, really well, and that's why we're scoring so well, but this part's not doing so well. And then understanding that this part of the process is broken, right? And then you kind of go on to, okay, how many products and services does my client have, right? On average, maybe it's 3-4 products. Maybe it's less than that, right? Depending on how well the bank does. But when you think about, even on the consumer side, you have checking, savings, a money market, home equity, line of credit, auto loan, debit card, credit card, and I'm at 8, and I'm sure I'm missing a ton of them, right? No bank has the full relationship because no bank has done it well. They have a little bit of the relationship, which makes it easier for those clients to leave, right? And think about low-cost deposits, the striving of every bank to get those deposits, right? And you work at it, and you work at it, and you work at it, and if we're leaving the back door open because we haven't created a great client experience, then all the work that we're doing to acquire new customers is really, you're on a spinning wheel. You're like a gerbil, just going around and around on that wheel, and nothing ever grows because you haven't put the time, effort, and energy in making it grow. I don't know, there's kind of long-winded explanation for that particular.
No, I thought it was great. It sounds like really diving in and getting a little bit granular with your data is the answer as far as tracking out what the customer, like you were saying, what the customer journey looks like, but also what your processes look like, where the friction lies, and how that's affecting how deep and how sticky your relationships are. So it sounds like you have to go kind of deep into your data and your metrics to be able to paint that picture for your C-suite and your board. It's not necessarily going to be summed up in one number.
Yeah, it is a lagging indicator of work that's done. But one of the things that is really obvious, and this comes across in the multitude of bankers I talk to at bank marketing school, or the experience of my colleagues throughout the country, is that execution is a hard thing to do. Everybody has a strategy. Everybody has an idea. Marketing ideas are a dime a dozen, but the magic happens when you can execute on what that particular point is. And with client experience and with Unreasonable Hospitality, you're talking about making and engineering a process that will continue to give back to the bank over and over and over again, as long as everybody buys in and everybody agrees to do those things. So it is a little bit of a process, and you have to kind of map it out, and you have to understand what you want as a bank. But at the same time, it can create great dividends and more retention, more acquisition, more cross-sell than any bank could really expect.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as I talk to bankers and think about it, you realize that some of the products that you named, I think a little bit earlier, are highly commoditized. A checking account is a checking account, a loan minus maybe the terms and the rates you can get is a loan. Debit card's a debit card, right? But community banks have really prided themselves on and set themselves apart from larger institutions on the experience they can offer and the relationship that they build with customers. And in that way, I think community banks, like the ones that ICBB serves, really would, the way they do business would lend itself really well to Unreasonable Hospitality. So do you think that's the final frontier for differentiation, or do you think fintechs can eventually replicate this with some kind of hyper-personalized AI, which I know you said there's pushback already happening to AI. So I'm curious what you think about that.
I think that AI and hyper-personalization helps to drive a relationship, but there's got to be an intermediary. And I don't think that a client is just going to say, "Oh, look I got this great offer. This is exactly what I needed." Some might, and some might not. I think the goal is to be proactive rather than reactive, to be engineered rather than haphazard, to be to know what the client's going to need before they need it, right? There's like, even in terms of having like a CRM process, right? Knowing who's coming in to see you on a monthly basis is really important. I know that Mrs. Smith comes in at the beginning of the month. She comes in once a month. I'm going to say hello to her. I know that her children are going to college. Understanding those pieces and having the AI position all of that stuff so it's front and center for you to position the products is important, but it's not the end all be all. I said before, the technology can never be the experience. It's never going to be. We talk about commoditization, right? And I had a boss who used to hate that term, and I hate it as well, because we've made it that way. There's a million restaurants, right? What does a restaurant do? It sells food, right? It sells food. But every restaurant has a different feel, a different way of interacting with the client, a different way of serving their food, and they've made themselves special, even though all they do is serve food. And so if bankers would think that way, that I can be something different rather than what the bank across the street looks like, then you start to be able to say, okay, how can I be different? How do I reach out to the client? What do I need to do? How do I need to behave when this situation occurs? How do I make sure that my business partners are on board with maybe quick, for instance, somebody has fraud on their card, right? They come in, they're really upset, right? That person in the moment, the most important thing to that person is the money that they're afraid is going to be lost on their account, right? What's the worst thing we could do? Say, we'll get back to you and take 3 days to get back to them, right? And that, the front line can't do that by themselves. They need to go back to operations. Maybe they'll need compliance, and they'll need different departments. But making sure that we're going to answer this client as soon as we can, even if we don't have an answer, is an answer, right? Mrs. Smith, we're still looking into your fraud issue. We've shut off your card. Your money is safe. It's not going anywhere. We'll make sure, but we don't know still what's going on, and we still have to look into that. And acting the way you want to be treated, right? It's like the golden rule. And some of this stuff has been lost because everybody technology is a little bit sexy, right? Everybody wants to play with that. But at the end of the day, these are people on the other side of this equation.
Absolutely. And I think the way that you've positioned it applies whether the customer is interacting with you in person, on the phone, or through an app, right? And you talk about removing friction from process isn't really a technology problem. It's about making things easier for people. So, it's not as though the approach you're suggesting is, averse to new technology. It's just, maybe more cautious, but it's beyond that, if that makes sense. Do I? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was in charge of digital transformation as well. I believe that stuff helps the process, because for the most part, people are using their mobile app, they're going online, they're using other forms of interaction with the bank instead of the bank branch, right? The bank branch is probably the most expensive version of things, but people are not coming into the bank 2-3 times a week. You're lucky you get them once a month, if you get that, right? I think technology is really important, and we should be as adept as possible. One of the things, as you were asking the question, I was thinking about is, I know that there's still some banks who do a test deposit before they allow an account to be open. Like, that's old school, right? Like, the technology exists to mitigate the risk, and you need to make sure that you've mitigated that risk, but at the same time, you need to make it very easy and intuitive for people to work with you. And if you haven't done that, then your client journey is clunky. Then your experience is, you haven't shown unreasonable hospitality, because, part of that whole concept is you bend over backwards to figure out how to make it easy for people to do business with you, right? And if you have friction points along every aspect of opening an account, servicing an account, then you haven't done your job. Then we haven't done our job as a bank to create a great client experience.
Absolutely. And I think, as I talk to a lot of banks who have been around a long time, sometimes I think we get it a little backwards in terms of what is a baseline, like what is, a baseline of people's expectations and what is truly a differentiator. Because, like I said, community banks pride themselves on their relationships and the tellers knowing your name when people walk into the branch. And they kind of think like, as long as we can depend on that, we will continue to see what we've always seen, right? And the technology pieces are nice to have, but really we need to focus on this, when really what you're saying, a lot of the technology that I think sometimes bankers are a little afraid of are about reducing friction, right? And, at the end of the day, convenience for a lot of people is not a nice to have, it's an expectation, because they're not going to come into your branch to do every single transaction. And if you try to make them, they'll go somewhere else, right? But if you can have that frictionless experience, to your point, and then the tellers know your name and they know that, your kid just went off to college, and they're like, oh, how's that? And they can communicate that with you, whether that's over the phone or in person or, however you communicate with them. I think that's how we win.
I absolutely agree. I think, it's not just one point anymore. And we have all been trained by the Amazons of the world, right? That, they're going to give us suggestions. They're going to make it easy. I can buy whatever I want throughout the whole world with one click, right? And as long as my card is there, I get what I need. And sometimes it arrives on my doorstep a day later because I have an Amazon facility right up the road from me, right? So that expectation of quickness, of customer service, even though if you have a problem, sometimes it's hard, right, to get to, because there's no people, right, to answer things. But we're not dealing with money. We're dealing with a product, right? And with money, like the behavioral economic people say, right? It is a visceral experience. People care very deeply. And sometimes they're not thinking with their head, they're thinking with their heart about their money, because it's so important. They work so hard for it. They've saved so long for it. It's a different experience with people's money than it is with a product.
No, absolutely. I agree. So I have one kind of last question for you to wrap everything up. So if a marketing director or, someone on a bank marketing team is listening to this, say on their, in their car on their way to work or, wherever, and they want to inject one element of unreasonable hospitality into their bank strategy by Friday, where would they start?
I think the only place to start is with the largest sales department in a bank, and have a conversation with your head of retail and sit down and say, listen, this is what I'm thinking. I'm not saying you're doing it wrong, but I'd like to start looking at some of these places that really are sticking points for clients. They have a life change. They have fraud. There are these points where people are really they don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. Can we look at what the journey looks like? Can we pull apart our NPS score? Can we pull apart our CSAT scores? Can we take a look at how this is happening? Can we try some things in it doesn't even have to be through your branch. One branch, one call center rep, figure out where to start, because you have to start somewhere. And the most logical place is the head of retail, because together sales and marketing can be a lot stronger than they can be separately.
Absolutely. All for sales and marketing collaboration. I think that needs to be more of the rule than the exception. Yes. Than it is for banking. Yeah. Well, Joanne, thank you so much for joining me today and for just sharing your insights. I think our community bankers are going to get a lot out of all the things you shared. And I think the way community banks do business, like I said, is really well positioned to be unreasonably hospitable to our customers. And I think that could really set them apart if they take these things to heart.
I think, I want community banking to win. It's really important. I used to work with a CFO, actually, who said that a community thrives with a community bank. And so it's really important that we figure out a way to help these small community banks, or not so small community banks, succeed.
Absolutely. And that's the heartbeat of what we do. So I'm really glad that you feel that way as well. So again, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Correspondent Podcast from Independent Correspondent Bankers Bank. We hope you've heard something that you can take back to your community bank. Be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, leave us a rating and review, or on Spotify, turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you next time, community bankers.